Welcome. Thank you very much for being here with me today. And it's a real pleasure to be at your headquarters. So as CEO of CIFOR-ICRAF, throughout my career, I have engaged deeply with gender issues, and I'm pleased to share lessons from both my experiences and the institution that I represent, CIFOR-ICRAF. So as you know, CIFOR-ICRAF is a member of the CGIAR Research Center, and in the over 50 years of the CGIAR system, I'm the first African woman to head a research center of the, in the living of the CGIAR system. And so what we do as a CGIAR Research Center is we work across forests, trees, and agroforestry landscapes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We focus on 3 interconnected global challenges where trees make a decisive difference: biodiversity loss, climate change, and food security. For over 4 decades of research and practice, our research has shown that forest and agroforestry systems can address all 3, especially when equity, inclusive value chains, and locally led leadership are built in from the start. CIFOR-ICRAF brings together more than 40 years of trusted science through the merger of the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. Through this work, we have supported the restoration of more than 1 million hectares of land and contributing to protecting over 135 million hectares, demonstrating how trees can help turn global challenges into durable opportunities. One of the things that is really key in terms of the work we do, our refresh strategy is organized around 4 priorities. Let me just make sure. And so the 4 priorities that we really look at is, first, climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we generate robust field and satellite evidence on carbon, land use trade-offs and resilience, and co-develop solutions with communities, governments, and partners. Second, biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. We safeguard biodiversity within production landscapes, conserve tree genetic resources, restore degraded ecosystems, and strengthen incentives and policies for stewardship, including globally led and women-led conservation. Third, we focus on food security and nutrition. We design climate-resilient agroforestry systems that rebuild soils, improve water retention, diversify production, and strengthen sustainable value chains and circular bioeconomy approaches. Fourth, secure and sustainable livelihoods and well-being. We advance land and resource rights, especially for women, for Indigenous peoples and local communities, supporting inclusive governance and enabling tree-based enterprises that turn stewardship into opportunity. This map reflects our long-standing presence and partnerships in the landscapes where responsible forest management must succeed at scale. And we bring both depth and reach to this work. So this represents over $2 billion of investment in research with over 2,200 projects across 92 countries with 192 partnerships. With over 800 staff and 25 country offices, we are also we've produced over 20,000 knowledge products. So with IIASA, given the footprint and the kind of decision-facing science we produce, partnerships are central to the work we do. One of the collaboration we value is with you, where our shared focus is turning evidence into tools and insights that decision makers can use. Here is one practical example of our collaboration with IIASA. Episteme, the evolving participatory information system for nature-based climate solutions, under Restore Plus Phase 2. So Episteme addresses a key bottleneck for scaling nature-based solutions, the lack of high-quality land and landscape data needed to plan interventions, mobilize finance, and track accountability. Any of you part of this program here? 2 people? Yay! So the project runs from June 2024 to June 2028, with implementation anchored in Indonesia and complementary land data strengthening in Brazil. I'm actually heading to Indonesia this weekend. So IIASA coordinates globally with CIFOR-ICRAF Indonesia, where we, on our side, lead implementation in country alongside PRIBRIN and WRI Indonesia. We begin with stakeholder consultation starting in South Sumatra to ensure that what we build responds to real operational needs. The broader point is that better data is not the endpoint. It is the foundation for credible, investable, and measurable action at landscape scale. So many of you know, in the age of AI, high quality data is the basis. And when AI fails, it's often because it's not grounded in high quality localized data. And so this is a really key area that we think is essential in terms of the type of work we want to lead and collaborate part of. So Episteme is delivering two complementary outputs that connect data to decisions and action at landscape scale. First is Episteme Luma, Land Use Mapping for All, an open source cloud-based platform that helps practitioners produce consistent land use and land cover maps from satellite imagery. Its value is comparability and decision readiness, including better representation of land use systems that are often missed, such as agroforestry. This supports deforestation prevention, restoration planning, MRV, and policy processes. A working prototype and the source code are already available. Second is a community of practice to drive uptake and quality. Partners test the platform in real context, share feedback, and contribute local knowledge and data through hands-on workshops while the project provides tools and guidance. As a result, not only is this a platform, but sustained capacity to use it well is also enhanced. The intended outcome is adoption. As key actors adopt standardized, accessible monitoring, data quality and transparency improve, collaboration strengthens, and decisions become more evidence-based. In Indonesia, this supports deforestation prevention and restoration at scale, with multiple benefits including carbon, biodiversity, and human well-being. The core lesson is simple. When agroforestry and other nature-based solutions appear on the map, they are more likely to enter planning, investment, and accountability systems. Having shown our work and our collaboration with IIASA, the key point is that systems shapes outcomes. The same is true for gender. Gender equality is not a parallel social objective. It is a precondition for sustainable forestry. Forest and landscape initiatives depend on land access, labor, decision-making, and legitimacy. Where rights, voice, or benefits are structurally unequal, outcomes are less durable and less equitable. I love this slide. So gender is a power lens, not synonymous with women. The term gender is often used as shorthand for women. In this presentation, gender is not synonymous with women. Gender is a category of analysis and a power lens. It helps us examine how authority and decision-making are organized, who controls property, land, and benefits, how labor and responsibility are distributed, who bears risk, whose knowledge is recognized as legitimate, and who is granted voice and credibility in public and in institutional spaces. This matters directly for forestry because the sector is not only male-dominated in employment and leadership, but also widely institutionally masculinized. Global estimates across 69 countries for 2017 to 2019 show women are under a quarter of forest-related employment. Beyond the numbers, research describes forestry workspaces as shaped by norms of macho masculinity and expectations that technical authority and leadership are male. So the sector's gender balance is not just a workforce statistic. It is tied to the rules, routines, and professional culture that shape whose expertise is recognized and whose interests are centered. When we connect these points, the analytical implication is that what appears neutral in forestry often encodes historically male defaults. Tenure recognition, extension targeting, governance formats, and success metrics may look purely technical, yet their effects are systematically patterned. So, what is also key is what is the data telling us about gender, climate, and economic risk? Closing the gender digital divide delivers large returns. And it's wonderful that our work is also highlighting that critical intersection of how forestry data and how power dynamics are working together in the right context. What we know is by 2050, around 343.5 million women and girls could benefit if we're able to close the digital gender divide. Economically, it could add $1.5 trillion to global GDP by 2030 and more than $100 trillion cumulatively by 2050. Beyond GDP, combined investments in education, labor markets, and women's digital access could mean 30 million more women and girls leaving extreme poverty and 42 million more women and girls becoming food secure by 2050 compared to business as usual. Climate change pushes in the opposite direction, amplifying existing inequalities and hitting those already most marginalized the hardest. Under a worst-case scenario, by 2050, climate change could push up to 158.3 million more women and girls into extreme poverty, with nearly half in sub-Saharan Africa. The number of additional women and girls impacted reaches 309.7 million at $3.65 per day, and at 422 million at $6.85 per day, which is up to 16.1 million more than the total number of men and boys. Food insecurity may also rise significantly, affecting up to 236 million more women and girls. This is why, in the context of this week's Forest Bioeconomy Conference happening in Vienna, how we look at that interface of data, gender, power will be critical on whether the forest bioeconomy helps us reach and scale the sustainable goals or not. Despite the stakes, women's priorities still too often sit at the margins of national climate responses. Only 39% of countries reviewed, 25 of 64, have coordination mechanisms such as task forces or working groups to integrate gender equality into climate policymaking across sectors. Without these structures, gender commitments rarely translate into delivery. Financing also does not match ambition. In 2022-23, less than 1% of bilateral allocated ODA targeting both climate and gender objectives went to women's rights organizations, even though these organizations are often closest to the communities and critical for implementation. Further funding contradictions risk erasing progress that is already limited at scale. A further structural reason these gaps persist is the unequal burden of unpaid care and domestic work. Women and girls spend 2.5 times more, as many hours per day, on unpaid care than men. In North Africa and West Asia, more than 4 times as many hours. This time constraint restricts education, decent work, and leadership. This is why investments in public services and care systems, including protection, health, education, and quality childcare, are core solutions. Finally, the digital transition itself is not neutral. With the rapid expansion of generative AI, employed women are nearly twice as likely as men to be in jobs at high risk of automation. 4.6%, 65 million jobs compared to 2.4%, 51 million jobs. In high-income countries, the gap is sharper, 9.6% for women versus 3.5% for men, reflecting occupational concentration in roles more exposed to automation, including clerical work. This means closing the digital divide is no longer only about access. It is also about skills, job transition, and ensuring AI policy and governance integrate a gender perspective so the transition expands opportunity rather than deepening inequality. What we know is that well-intentioned institutions can reproduce discrimination. If gender is a power lens, then institutions are one of the main places where power is organized and reproduced. Even with the best intentions, institutions can perpetuate injustice, and often unconsciously, by continuing with business as usual. In forestry, gender-neutral approaches frequently dominate sector norms as the baseline, and those norms have historically centered men's interests and authority. This shows up clearly in career trajectories, in managerial positions. Women's representation is around 30%, and the pace of change suggests Gender parity could take nearly a century. That pattern is a signal of a persistent glass ceiling, not a pipeline problem. Three mechanisms are especially important to watch. First, gatekeeping of expertise. Who is invited, who is heard, who is considered technical, shapes which problems get attention and which solutions are seen as credible. And so that's why I'm also so grateful to be here with all of you today. Second, participation without influence. Women may be present in meetings or groups, but if agenda setting, decision rules, and control over benefits do not change, participation remains descriptive rather than transformative. Third, measurement bias. Counting attendance or outputs can create fake sense of equity. What matters is whether voice, benefits, and burdens are shifting over time. This is why gender efforts often stall at mainstreaming. When the agenda becomes bureaucratized, gender is reduced to compliance rather than a practice that changes incentives, procedures, and accountability. The goal is not simply representation, it is institutional legitimacy and better decisions. Institutions that reflect diverse populations tend to earn greater public trust, strengthen knowledge quality, and deliver more equitable outcomes. Now, the issue of tenure. Tenure is one of the clearest places where rules that look neutral can systemically produce unequal outcomes, because tenure determines who is recognized as a rights holder and therefore as a legitimate decision maker. In many contexts, the system carries a male default. Men are likely to be treated as the natural owners, representatives, and signatories, even when policies are formally gender neutral. A first mechanism is registration practice. Titling and registration often default to a single household head signatory, and household head is frequently interpreted as male. Even where policy allows joint or individual rights, implementation commonly recognizes one claimant, which shapes who becomes visible to the state, programs, and financial institutions as the decision authority. A second mechanism is that incentives follow formal names. Restoration payments, payment for ecosystem services, and carbon credits typically move through registered land titles and bank accounts. And when titles default to men, benefits default to men. That channels new value to those already recognized as owners, not necessarily to those providing labor and daily stewardship. Even when participation appears balanced, control over benefits can widen. A third mechanism is that being listed does not guarantee control. Decisions on land use, contracts, and cash flows are often governed by intra-household bargaining and local authority structures, not documentation alone. Formal recognition can matter, but it rarely operates in isolation, especially where authority norms remain male-centered. A case from coastal Tanzania illustrates the stakes. In the large-scale sugarcane land deal, compensation forms listed only male household heads unless the household was female-headed, which means often she was a widow. Many women expected they would not benefit and feared the payout could undermine household security, including abandonment or husbands taking additional partners. These dynamics are not only a rights issue, they directly shape adoption compliance and benefit distribution, which is exactly what many of our models aim to predict. One other area that's really critical is really looking at gender-blind system boundaries, how they produce unstable projections because they leave key drivers of adoption outside the model. In many land use models, we often draw a straight line from incentives like payments for ecosystem services or carbon payments to adoption, and then to outcomes such as carbon and livelihood. When system models treat households as unitary actors and tenure as a neutral variable, they can produce unstable projections because key drivers of adoption sit outside the model boundary. Many land use models draw a straight line, and what this does is uptake is rarely driven by incentives alone. It is mediated by who controls land, who has decision authority, and who can act on an opportunity. This is where gender dynamics operate as structural drivers, not peripheral detail. The figure shows that often what is assumed but strongly shapes the outcome. Household bargaining influences whether a household adopts, who bears the work, and who controls the return. Labor constraints and care burdens determine whether participation is feasible or whether adoption adds costs that are not visible in the model. Informal norms and legitimacy shape who is allowed to lead, speak, sign, and benefit, and whether women's participation translates into influence. If these drivers are excluded, models can overestimate uptake, misjudge the distribution of benefits and risks, and generate projections that look coherent on paper but fail under real-world conditions. The takeaway is to treat gender as part of the system architecture. Ask, what is inside the model boundary and what is assumed away? Then test how uptake and outcomes change when tenure control, bargaining dynamics, labor constraints, and legitimacy norms are represented explicitly. If adoption pathways are mediated by power and norms, then we cannot assume that income participation and even tenure reform will automatically translate into empowerment. So there are no automatic gains. Income does not automatically translate into empowerment, and participation does not automatically translate into empowerment. What we know is that in order for decision-making to align with participation in income and empowerment, tenure reform does not also automatically translate into equality. When the value of land, force, or commodity increases, control over benefits can shift, sometimes away from those who have long relied on the resources, even when their labor contributions remain constant. This is why well-intentioned programs can backfire when they do not account for context and power relations. A project can look successful on output metrics, yet still increase burdens, reinforce exclusion, or trigger backlash. If you think about computer science and its evolution, in the early days of computer science, when the jobs were very low paid, women actually dominated that space. But as the incomes went up, less and less women were present in computer science. And so one of the things that is really key for us is evidence also cautions against assuming that income alone secures women's agency. Research on inter-household decision-making in over 3,000 households in Ethiopia found that increases in women's income did not reliably translate into greater decision-making power. In some cases, women compensated for taking on roles seen as men's responsibilities by more strictly performing traditional gender roles, including deference to maintain household stability. So this is where the issue of gender-based violence and power dynamics around who controls money can become an issue. The implication is that income alone is not sufficient to get to agency. In some contexts, increased income can intensify control, backlash, or expectations, leaving women worse off. These outcomes reflect wider social relations, and they need to be built into theories of change, safeguards, and measures of success. At CIFOR-ICRAF, we use gender transformative approaches to move beyond counting participation and instead change the conditions that produce unequal outcomes. We focus on norms, relationships, and institutions because this is where power is organized, reinforced, and reproduced. In practice, we address structural barriers, unequal workloads, and imbalances in authority, so decision-making and control over benefits can shift within households, communities, and organizations. We also create safer spaces for dialogue and experimentation where women and men can test new roles, build trust, and reduce the social and economic risks that often accompany changes in norms. We apply an intersectional lens, recognizing that gender intersects with age, income, ethnicity, and social status, shaping who can participate, lead, and benefit. We also engage men and boys as allies because durable change depends on shifts in shared expectations, not only individual empowerment. Methodologically, we prioritize participatory, locally grounded learning. Solutions are co-developed with women and communities, not delivered as a technical package. We operationalize this through a disciplined cycle, identify who is excluded and where decisions power sits, analyze barriers and incentives, design interventions that shift norms and institutions, and measure changes in influence, benefits, burdens, and roles. This is how we move from activity to outcomes and from short-term inclusion to durable transformation. This approach only works if we are precise about what we mean by progress and if we measure change at the real level. This pathway is useful because it helps us separate activity from change. Reaching people is not the same as benefiting them. Benefiting is not the same as empowerment. Empowerment is not the same as transformation. It gives us a clear structure for defining indicators and learning questions at different levels, so we do not stop at counting participants. REACH asks whether women can participate on equal terms, on whether time, mobility, information, social norms, and safety create barriers. Just a fact, are we timing meetings when women are cooking, are taking children to school? Think about who gets to show up. Benefit asks whether participation improves well-being without shifting costs and burdens onto women. Empower focuses on agency and influence, including whether women can negotiate, control resources, and shape decisions. And transform is where systems change, where norms, rules, incentives, and institutional practices shift so progress is durable. The guiding question throughout remains the same. Did participation translate into influence, control over resources, and shifts in norms or rules, or did we only deliver activity? So what does gender transformative action look like in practice? Up to now, I focused on the problem, premises, and the mechanisms that can block durable change. This slide marks a shift from framework to application. In practice, gender transformative approaches are not a separate gender component. They show up as concrete decision choices that change who participates, who influences decisions, and who controls benefits. We work across both innovation and the enabling environment, addressing constraints such as time burdens, access to information and finance, and land and resources rights, alongside the norms and institutional rules that shape legitimacy and leadership. The next example illustrates what it looks like operationally and how we assess whether inclusion translated into influence, strengthened accountability, and produced changes that persist beyond a single project. So looking at land rights movement and tech integration, globally, women hold only about 15% of land titles, even though they make up nearly half of all farmers. For smallholder farmers, particularly women, land is not just a productive asset, it is security. It shapes whether they can invest, access credit, plan for the long term, and withstand shocks. Without secure tenor, returns on labor and inputs remain vulnerable, and bargaining power inside households and communities is weakened. This is why the Stand for Her Land movement matters. It mobilizes country coalitions to shift norms and decision rules in households, customary systems, and formal institutions, so women's claims are treated as legitimate and enforceable. The movement is deliberately adaptive. It learns across contexts, shares what works, and adjusts tactics as conditions change. Technology strengthens that ecosystem when it is designed around safety and real-world access. The IIASA app provides multiple channels, including phones, SMS, and community paralegals, so women can report violations and trigger follow-up. In Kenya, it has recorded more than 166 cases with early resolutions through mediation and courts. What matters is not just reporting. The aggregated evidence becomes leverage for advocacy and reform, making institutions more accountable. Together, Stand for Her Land and IIASA show how gender transformative practice works. When rights become actionable and institutions respond, women gain security and bargaining power. That increases investment, confidence, expands women-led based entrepreneurship, and makes outcomes more durable because the rules and accountability mechanisms have shifted, not just participation numbers. So land finance. Capital is a binding constraint that keeps many restoration and land-based businesses from scaling. Micro, small, and medium enterprises often struggle to access finance, not because they lack potential, but because they are not sufficiently visible or eligible to investors. The Land Finance Hub was designed to address this gap as an online marketplace that increases both the capacity and the visibility of forestry and agriculture, micro, small, and medium enterprises so they can access green finance. To do that, we piloted the Land Finance Hub as a structured platform linking small and medium enterprises directly with investors. And we paired the marketplace with targeted support to strengthen investment readiness. What made our approach different is that it wasn't only about numbers or business plans. We integrated gender equality and social inclusion trainings, so women's leadership, staffing, and sourcing were documented clearly in enterprise profiles and treated as part of investment quality. This aligned with what investors consistently tell us that they are looking for: reliability, strong risk controls, and governance practices that signal operational resilience. When women's roles and decision-making structures are visible, investors can assess them as part of the enterprise's capacity to deliver and manage risk, which strengthens the investment case. We also backed this with concrete services such as finance readiness audits and stronger packaging of enterprise data for lenders, ensuring enterprises can present credible evidence rather than intention. The result is a clearer pathway from inclusive enterprise performance to investability, particularly on this age where granting, financing, identifying, funding is very difficult. How you scale bankability and how you do research becomes more and more important. Making women's leadership and governance visible helps direct capital towards businesses that are well-positioned to deliver resilient value chains and durable landscape outcomes, because the enabling conditions for accountability and long-term performance are strengthened alongside the funding pipeline. So tools like the Regreening app, the Right Tree, Right Place, Right Purpose turn data into real decisions. Part of the products that we have put out are our digital products. So for example, the Regreening app allows farmers to map plots, geotag trees, and track growth and management practices over time. It was built with farmers and extension workers, which makes it usable in the conditions where decisions are made, including low connectivity settings. The aim is better learning loops, improved management, and higher survival and performance of trees. Right Tree, Right Place, Right Purpose complements this by supporting choices about species selections and placement based on intended outcomes, whether fodder, fuel, income, restoration, climate change needs are the parameters we're using. When these tools connect to seed and seedling supply, aftercare support, survival checks, and simple traceability, they become part of a wider service model rather than a standalone product. That service model also creates new roles for women as nursery entrepreneurs, follow-up providers, and data stewardships, which strengthens both livelihoods and local accountability. The result is more confident decision-making, better tree survival and productivity, and stronger income and resilience outcomes. This is what it looks like when gender transformative practices meet technology. The tool is useful, the system around it is inclusive, and benefits are more likely to be sustained. So to close, a gender strategy is not a communication, product, or a compliance layer. It is part of research quality because it shapes what we see, what we assume away, and what our evidence can credibly support. Drawing on what we have learned working at the intersection of forest, climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development, a consistent pattern emerges. Gender imbalance in our sectors and institutions is not an isolated problem. It reflects wider social norms about authority, expertise, and whose work is valued. Those norms can unconsciously enter our systems through what we treat as technical, through who gets heard, and through the metrics and incentives we use to define success. With that in mind, I will leave you with 4 practical considerations. First, interrogate epistemic assumptions. Ask what counts as technical, whose evidence shapes research questions, and which forms of knowledge are treated as sidelined. These choices shape models, problem definitions, and ultimately policy advice. Second, audit incentives and performance metrics. Ensure success is not defined only by speed and scale, but also by legitimacy, distributional outcomes, and durability. Third, embed gender in modeling and evidence practice. not as disaggregation at the end, but as structural drivers inside analysis, bargaining power, tenure asymmetries, labor constraints, and care burdens, and informal norms that shape adoption and benefit control. Fourth, institutional reflexivity. Who decides, who leads, and how do we partner? If we want different outcomes in the world, we also need to examine how our own routines and partnerships reproduce or interrupt inequality. If these elements are built into the architecture of the work, the result is better science and stronger outcomes. Projections become more robust, recommendations more implementable, and benefits more likely to be shared in ways that are credible, equitable, and durable. So thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections, and I look forward to your perspectives and to a thoughtful exchange. Thank you very much.